Hey everyone, happy Saturday morning. Thanks for waking up early. All right, so today we're going to talk about cybersecurity in the aviation industry. And if you're expecting this to be a presentation on hacking airplanes, I am sorry to disappoint you. We'll cover a little bit of background information, but it's really going to be more on the overall posture of the cybersecurity ecosystem in the aviation industry. So of course I have my disclaimer because I like what I do and I want to keep presenting at conferences like Bsides. So none of this is endorsed by or sponsored by any previous or past employers that I had, because I still like working for them, and it's an overall reflection of my experiences in the aviation cybersecurity industry. Most importantly, everything that I found you can find on the open internet. Nothing is proprietary, and I'm a huge advocate of showing your references, so I will give all of that at the end of this presentation. The little QR code is, I would love your feedback. It's for a quick survey I have, if this was what you expected or if there was any topics that I didn't cover that you'd like to hear in future presentations. So one of the times I gave this presentation, someone wanted more information on the sort of like the certification process. So I was able to try to dig out some more information to answer more questions. All right, so just a little bit about me. So you know I'm not full of FUD and I'm not making all of this up, but about 12 years ago, I began as a software developer by degree. That wasn't a huge fan of coding all the time. It doesn't spark joy. But I love interacting with people. So when I'm not doing cybersecurity, I'm a curler by trade. So that would be awesome to keep doing again once the pandemic is done. I was super fortunate that when I started my career out of college, I was able to work on a bunch of transportation related programs. So I worked on a air command and control system, I worked on a GPS system used by aircraft, and I eventually found my way to Panasonic Avionics, where I got to work on an in-flight entertainment system, which was really cool. So I focused on the crew terminal and its functionality specifically for the IFE system. And I got very lucky again that I was at the right place at the right time, where I found the cybersecurity product director and was able to make a connection. And since I got into security, I just never looked back. So I've been geeking out for about 6 years doing that. All right, scope. So to cover that, before I start talking about anything in specifics, I want to just frame the scope of the discussion. So we're going to talk about some regulatory aspects, the players and components in the aviation ecosystem, and then I end with some use cases and experiences I had, which is great. So the not specific hacking. I'm not talking about hacking on planes, because please don't do that, but more of here's potential use cases that may lead to vulnerabilities. So for anybody who works in the industry, this is an overview, probably no more than I do or what I'm going to present. So if you have questions, stick them in Discord. I'm going to hope to look at things when I can, but I know our moderator is going to do an excellent job of pinging me as well. Cybersecurity regulation. So regulation varies depending on the location that you're in. And for a supplier manufacturer, it's important because they have to comply with several different government agencies. Specifically for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the current US regulation, but it's very similar to the EU and other regulatory authorities. So specifically for aviation cybersecurity, there are 3 key documents, and here come all the fun acronyms and numbers. DO stands for document or document order. And when you get the hard copy printouts, they are these like big, thick books that If you have insomnia, they're great for like bedside reading. And we're going to start with DO 326A, so Airworthiness Security Process Specification. So why do we need this process? When safety assessments were initially developed, they focused on failure of onboard systems and not failure caused by malicious intent. So this process fills the gaps by defining security scope for the certification process for new development of systems or modification of existing systems. So in addition to the scope, it lists a long list of additional requirements, including having security risk assessments and other effective requirements. The next one is DO 356A. It explains what methods to show compliance to the processes referenced in DO 326A. So for example, if you're developing a security architecture, what should be your corresponding measures for that? If there's any assurance guidance for verification activities like threat assessments, or what systems should you have logging enabled so that they're properly monitoring your environment so you can be aided in incident response. Lastly, there's DO 355. So once the plane is flying, how do you ensure the cybersecurity of that aircraft once it's been handed over to the air operator? So this regulation and document was really important when I worked at American Airlines. This was the one that the security team specifically looked at. So it highlights what you should have in regards to incident response, what personnel roles you need from an aircraft information security specialist, which is relatively new type of role. All right. So cybersecurity regulation. So who needs to follow these three documents? Specifically, it's for aircraft with special conditions and what causes an aircraft to have a special condition. So this is directly from an FAA document that says this airplane will have a novel or unusual design feature when compared to the state of technology envisioned in the airworthiness standards for transport category airplanes. These new connectivity capabilities may result in security vulnerabilities to the airplane's critical systems. For these design features, the applicable airworthiness regulations do not contain adequate or appropriate safety standards for protection and security of airplane systems and data networks against unauthorized access. These special conditions contain the additional safety standards that the administrators consider necessary to establish a level of safety equivalent to that established by existing standards. Very long-winded, but in a nutshell, back in the day when these planes were created, we didn't have these networks and systems on the planes. Therefore, this special conditions is going to cover those gaps. So what types of aircraft have these special conditions? Examples would be like the 787, 737 MAX, A350, anything that has the newer types of networking systems on board. So what do we do for these aircraft? We have something called an ANSP, which is an Aircraft Network Security Program. And this ANSP is an agreement between the air operator and the manufacturers on how they plan to secure the aircraft, and that's signed off by your regulatory body, which would be the FAA in the US. So the ANSP captures guidance so that, like, if there's any system modifications or updates, they're not going to negatively impact the continuing airworthiness due to cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And most often, the ANSP is leveraging existing cybersecurity frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework, and it uses common standards as well. So the main takeaway from these documentation is that its emphasis is on safety of flight and framing that in the aspect of cybersecurity. So how do we do that? By using a defense in-depth security approach. All right, so who needs to follow these regulations? There are a lot of players in the aviation ecosystem. And there's several lists, but the one I like the most is a compilation from the 2018 U.S. National Strategy for Aviation Security. And they highlight that there's 6 A's, or 6 players in the game. And the first one is aircraft. So of course the plane itself, and prior to COVID, there were over 24 commercial flights daily over the US, and the category includes government and private aircraft in that figure. The next player are the airlines. So what's highlighted in the airlines section is that there are airlines of multiple sizes covering functional scope of operations and maintenance. So you want to consider that there are several different enterprise networks of an airline that span more than just the aircraft. So you may have a separate passenger system or a ground system, that all flowing information. My favorite sentence in regards to the airlines is, how an airline is managed has impact on its safety and the security of the aviation ecosystem. Every player on this slide has an equal impact to the ecosystem. None of them is more important than the others. The next one is airlift, and when I first read about this, I was like, huh, what is that? But airlifts are just the cargo version of airlines, and even though they don't have passengers, they have the same stringency of regulation. So just because it's cargo doesn't mean it's any easier. And more importantly, they have an amazing, great economic impact. The International Air Transport Association said that the world trade by value of these cargo airlifts is about $6 trillion that is being transported. So any impact to them is huge to the economy. Next are airports. There's over 44,000 airports globally and about 19,000 in the US. So when you think of airports, you might think of like the big hubs that you see, or maybe some small regional ones, but they also include package delivery hubs and logistical airports. And logistical airports are really cool because if you have ever seen them, they're where like aircraft scenes are filmed for movies, or where aircraft or airlines store aircraft when they're not being used right now. In addition to the physical airport location itself, the entity that runs the airport is also included in this category. And that could vary. Some are privately owned, some are owned by city or public authorities, so that's included as well. Next is aviation management. So that is your national or international regulatory body, and they manage the operation and administration of the aviation ecosystem. So of course, the FAA in the US, EASA in Europe, and there's several individual civil aviation authorities in other countries. So that's, for the US, that would be where air traffic control would reside. Lastly are actors, and this group is categorized as people or entities that operate, maintain, or utilize the aspects of the aviation ecosystem. So this includes, I see it as a very wide catch-all bucket, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it includes the original equipment manufacturers, also known as OEMs, suppliers, so like in-flight entertainment companies or internet connectivity providers, and contractors, so your cleaning crews, your food service suppliers. They also include threat actors in this group, which I don't think it's fair, or insider threats, because they can exist, insider threats specifically can exist anywhere inside either of these 6 groups listed. All right. So now we know how the players fit into the operational aspects of the aviation ecosystem. Excuse me. So now we know who the players are. We know the regulatory background. Now I'm going to talk about how the players fit into the operational aspects of the ecosystem. I'm not a pilot, so when I was trying to frame the scope of how I was going to talk about this, I took it as a passenger because most people can relate to flying. So I'm going to talk about in regards to what happens before a flight, during a flight, or after a flight. So what a passenger sees barely scratches the surface. And this graphic that I'm showing right now is courtesy of NASA, and it captures the major components, but just remember that they're framing it from a government perspective. So if you're like, there's something missing, that's the reason why. All right, so before the flight, before you buy your ticket, there's several activities in place so that you can reserve your seat or ship your cargo on an airlift carrier. If we go back to our certification, the aircraft needs to be certified safe to fly by your civil aviation authority, and you need to have approved staff to do that. So you have your approved pilots that know they do their check around the aircraft. Even when you walk, before you walk into the airport, you have your TSA, your transportation security in the US, Customs and Border Patrol staff, you have your airport ground crews, your airline gate crews, additional flight crew that have all been vetted beforehand. Then you go to planning. So what staff is needed? You need staff certified to fly that specific aircraft. How many flights are needed overall? What type of aircraft do you need? For example, you're not going to want a regional jet for a long haul international flight. And then you jump into reservations. So what passenger and cargo options are available to offer to the public? Do you need next day delivery? Do you need full internet connectivity on those long haul flights? And what locations are you going to offer that at? Next, you have what happens in the ecosystem during your flight. So as your Amazon Prime package spends so many hours on the aircraft, or you're sitting in your seat, there's even more going on behind the scenes. You have your avionics system that's active on the aircraft. You have your cabin functionality, which either is available to the passenger or to the crew. So a good example I like to give from a crew standpoint is that weather is very important. So you want to make sure weather information is being accurately transmitted to the aircraft so that the flight crew can make accurate decisions on the best course of travel. And then you have your air traffic management that's providing navigation information. Lastly, you have after your flight. So once you land, there's still a lot going on once you're on the ground. So your plane gets checked again by the pilot. They may need to call the ground crew, or the ground crew does their own checks to say that there needs to be maintenance. You want to make sure your bags get routed to either the baggage claim if you're done with your journey, or to the next flight that you're going on. And then there's information regarding the flights themselves. So are you going to run to the other end of the airport because your next flight is in the other terminal? And then there's even continued comms with ground systems. So if you put everything I said together, that is the operational aspects of the aviation ecosystem. Awesome. Now we have to secure all of this. What is aviation cybersecurity? So it's every single system related to the functions that I previously referenced. So now I'm going to speak about the experiences I've had in the industry. So I was on a aviation cybersecurity team when I worked for American Airlines, and then Panasonic Avionics, so their point of view is from a third-party supplier. Here is another nifty graphic that I really like. It's from the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And in 2013, they developed a white paper entitled A Framework for Aviation Cybersecurity. And they had a section that references that aviation and the evolution of information and communications technology. And what it highlighted was that once the plane was a closed system, and then due to events in industry, it expanded based off of demand. And I'll give more specifics on that later in my presentation. And if you're thinking, oh, I want to read this paper, don't worry, I have everything referenced at the end of my presentation with links so that you can find it later if you want to read up on that. More importantly, I have this presentation in PDF format on my website. So you can go to oliviastella.com if you want to get a copy of that. All right. So now that you're thinking about securing all this data, you have to do it for each part of the system, and it's a lot. And you can't do it by yourself, no matter how big of a company you are. And more importantly, you're dependent on others in the ecosystem, and you're under the watchful eye of your government jurisdiction. So I'm going to start with the focus from the airplane, because that was my initial point of entry into the ecosystem. So the ecosystem employee experience versus the passenger experience is a little bit different. So when you think of onboard systems, there's the native ones like the avionics, then there's your third-party systems like your passenger internet connectivity and the entertainment systems. So how do we talk to the rest of the world via these systems? Well, ground communication is different than connectivity in flight. So if you think about your Wi-Fi and your cellular versus your SATCOM, your images. And then you have to support all the infrastructure for these communication systems. All right. Then you have your external environment, the systems that support that. So if you're thinking from an airport perspective, you'd have your ticket kiosks, your baggage claim systems, and any on-site maintenance systems. If you go another level removed, you can think of all the IoT, Internet of Things devices and systems that your third-party companies are using. So for instance, the catering crew needs to know how many meals for the specific flight, your cleaning crew. If you're doing a wide-body aircraft, you're probably going to need maybe 2 to 3 times as many people as an narrow-body aircraft. And they could be all sharing the same infrastructure, depending on how it's set up within the airport. So how do you secure all the data for each parts of those systems? Those were the slides. The past slides I referenced was the world I was living in when I was working at the airline. And it's a really interesting problem when you think about it, how to keep everything secure. So before I jump into more specific aspects of aviation cybersecurity, I want to spend a little time focusing on the aircraft. When I gave this presentation at a past conference, people were like, where's my plane information? I want to hack the plane. Please don't do that. But I will give you a little bit of background of how the data domains on the aircraft are split up and what exactly exists. So this graphic is courtesy of Connected Aviation Today, and they list the domains in criticality to safety of flight. So remember, we're referencing safety of flight again. So remember, safety of flight and data security. So the first domain is the aircraft control domain. This is the most critical to safety operation of the aircraft, including the flight control applications and core cabin functions. Next is the Airline Information Services domain, or the AISD, more acronyms. And one of the best descriptions that I found for that was from ICAO's 2014 description, saying that it provides services and interconnectivity to the other domains while creating another security permitted. It's too early for a Saturday. Also, the ISD can be categorized into 2 subdomains. So there's an administrative subdomain and there's a passenger support subdomain. So the passenger support one, of course, supports passenger systems. And then the administrative subdomain includes airline administrative information to the flight deck and the cabin. The third one is the one that you would be most familiar with when you are flying yourself. So that would be the passenger information and entertainment services domain, or PISD, as a lot of people call it. And it's the most dynamic in regards to functionality because we need to keep up with the devices that you're bringing on the plane. So like how Apple just announced their new cell phones, if they had any new functionality, you may need to have a IFE system that could interact with it. I doubt there's new functionality. But this includes any live connectivity. It could also include, like, if you have if you're happen to be in business class and you have a fancy seat, it could be the seat actuators or the passenger messaging systems. All right. So this is one of the reasons why I really love the aviation industry in regards to cybersecurity. So we understand the rules that came from all these awesome regulatory books, and I give a highlight of the ecosystem and its data domains. So how do we treat this unique ecosystem? Is it really IT, information technology, or is it more of OT, operational technology? When I think of an OT environment, I see electrical grids, water treatment plants, nuclear power plants, facilities that if there were a failure, there would be a negative impact to the safety of human life. And if you happen to be an OT professional, sweet, I am not an expert. Hit me up on Discord afterwards if there's any other details you have, because I'd be really interested in finding that out. So does that mean the aircraft is an industrial control system? Not exactly, but it's not your traditional IT system either due to the safety of flight aspect. More of our environment became open in regards to tech and connectivity. And the more that these two areas converge, it just blurs in the middle. So from the avionic aspects of the aircraft, systems in the aircraft control domain could be comparable to OT SCADA, like software. If something goes wrong, there would be a high risk to loss of life, similar to like a nuclear plant disaster. But if you think about the passenger devices and the PIES domain, that's your IT aspect with the latest and greatest tech and software that's potentially more vulnerable than your OT software. So living in that fuzzy gray area where IT and OT collide is really unique, and you don't see too much like that. And I like to phrase it as we're an industrial control system in a commercial environment with OT-like regulations and IT needs from passengers and the business. So sometimes it's as clear as mud, but it really keeps your day job very interesting. And if you're like most people that originated from the IT world, ICS could be relatively new to you. And if you want to learn about it, there's some cool free web-based trainings brought to you by DHS, and it's up to you if you want to give them your information, because I think you have to give like an email address and your first and last name. But you give your info and you get a lot of cool information from these classes. All right, this is my favorite part of the presentation that I lovingly like to call aviation unicorns. So I wanted to provide a few unique use cases that I have seen and or experienced when I was in industry that sets aviation apart from typical IT and OT environments. Software patching and upgrades. Back when I worked at Panasonic, this is something I personally experienced. So it was very important to have a good communication path with your customers. For example, if we needed to get either a patch out or a software upgrade, and it didn't matter if it was security related, the teams were always, we'd go in a major crunch if we had to make sure that the software was properly tested and bundled in the appropriate way that it could be handed to the customer in less than a day if we needed to. Yay for processes, because we were able to recreate all of our stringent guidelines and make sure that the software was in the right state when it was released. So we'd hand over the software to the customer, and the customer owns the system, so we have no control over when it would get updated because we don't own the aircraft and every airline is different. So how did we overcome that uniqueness? In our industry, you need to have great communication, and there's so many segments in the supply chain. Being able to know who you need to involve is very important. So if you compare that to IT, and you think of your cell phone again, software updates get pushed, and eventually your phone's going to get locked if you don't upgrade. We all see that, and we all say, yeah, we agree to whatever updates they're going to do. You don't want that to happen on your aircraft, especially in an OT environment. What's nice is that operators have the luxury to make updates based off of recommendations of the manufacturer. And they have compensating controls in place too, to say, you know what, if we're not going to do this update, we have controls XYZ in place until we can do this update. So if it was that closed environment that has no internet connectivity, it might be okay to wait to do that type of an update. But more importantly, the system owner has that option. So how do we combat against that in this unique situation? I'm going to refer to defense in depth again. So for instance, the hardware only allows certain software packages to be loaded to it. It's looking for that. The software is signed, and roots of trust exist. More importantly, the aircraft is an embedded system. It's not an open operating system that's caught off the shelf. The hardware is more robust as well, in that if you see that it's running Linux or some type of common operating system, it really is not. It's severely stripped down. And for example, the software can only be loaded via an official manual push to the aircraft subcomponent. So there's a lot of different items in place to make sure that there's additional checks. All right, the ever-expanding attack surface. Since IoT technology has been incorporated, it's drastically changed our attack surface because the aircraft was designed to be a closed system initially. But due to its long lifespan, new technology continues to be added. We want that new functionality when we fly. And the moment we added SATCOM and internet connectivity, everything exploded, as we've seen through hacking claims. And the first time I learned about how interesting IoT was, I was actually at a conference, and the speaker was talking about a Wi-Fi water kettle. And I am an avid tea drinker, as I've been holding my mug the whole time. And the Wi-Fi kettle and similar devices are just an unsecure entry vector into your home network. And luckily, when you compare that back to the aircraft, it's an embedded system with defense in depth, and there are several safeguards. So when you think of IoT, it's not really comparing it apples to apples. So for example, the experience I had, the USB ports on the aircraft, though you may see a lot of them, several of them have been, they've had wires clipped in it so that it's power only. The data's physically been turned off via that wire clipping. So the main point I want to make for this one is just that IoT is something that the industry really cares about. It's on their radar, and they know that they're going to have to increase their scope to accommodate that. And back when I worked at American, the scope of our team was aviation, cybersecurity, and Internet of Things technology. So they were looking at that. Software patching and upgrades. So when I talked about this topic, it was interesting. I got called out in person on stage because someone cut me off early. So the great thing about virtual conferences is that I get to talk about it first, and that doesn't happen. But it's an awesome segue into a potential future state of what's being discussed, which are over-the-air updates. So depending on the software that you're trying to update and load, it could take minutes to hours to load an update. And in the industry, when a plane isn't flying because it's either out of service or you're doing updates or maintenance, that's bad because you're not flying, you're not transporting passengers. So the thought process was, if a car can do an over-the-air update, why not a plane? Well, there are multiple reasons. First, there are initial talks that if this were to happen, it would be in the Bsides space, so the passenger domain space. You definitely do not want to do this on an avionics or a critical system in the aircraft control domain while in flight, because there are specific items listed that you need to have testing and verification that the software was loaded correctly, it's signed off on, it's not taken lightly at all that you would want to do that over the air. But if you compare that to your in-flight entertainment system, if it doesn't update properly, the system could be shut down. Unfortunate that the passengers don't get to use the system, whether it be purchasing items or whatnot. But depending on the airline's risk tolerance, that may or may not be okay. So it's up to the business case of that airline in that specific instance. So for instance, how much revenue are you willing to lose? More important, robust system that's backwards compatible and that can fail over gracefully if the update happens to not work. So all of those things are items to think about. But once it becomes successful in one aircraft, a proof of concept, I see that it's probably going to creep into the other domains. But luckily, we have the stringent safety standards, and anything that happens in the aviation industry does not happen overnight. It is very, very slow. And there's a lot of steps in between to make sure that items are properly vetted. And all of the players I mentioned in the aviation ecosystem get to speak on whether or not they agree with that, because we all work together with our suppliers, our OEMs. So it's something to be aware of, and I try to keep an open mind, but I wouldn't be afraid of jumping on a plane right now and having those types of updates be a concern. All right. So how do you deal with all these awesome aviation unicorns that spit out vulnerabilities and threats as opposed to awesome, pretty rainbows? And it's something simple that people may not think about, but it's just having constant communication with common goals. So one of the reasons I loved working in that industry, and it was one of the hardest things to step back, was that every security team, regardless of what organization you're in, has the same goal. We care about the safety, the privacy, and the security of our passengers and their data when they're traveling with us. So back, I was talking on a daily basis with my competitors, with my manufacturers and suppliers to make sure that we were all in the loop when it came to current and future threats and what we could do to improve processes, best practices, anything in our space. And I thought it was unique to be in an environment where you're working with your competitors and it's a non-compete type of atmosphere. So if you're lucky enough to be in that type of environment too, it's really cool. And it makes perfect sense, but when you think about it, at the end of the day, an attack or threat to one player in the ecosystem is an impact to everybody. So how is that done? It's through information sharing, and there are great organizations that already exist that allow this to happen. So the Aviation ISAC is one of my favorites. It's the Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And then there's also IATA, like who I referenced earlier. So through those organizations and individual companies, the industry is just growing to better engage the research community. And this is one I really like to harp on with my counterparts when I was back in the industry, because more importantly, we need to do better. There has been signs of progress. So there's a lot more aviation companies that are offering bug bounty programs and vulnerability disclosure programs. For those who attended DEF CON, I took a break from Hacker Summer Camp this past summer, but we're seeing more engagement. So when the Aviation Village, now Aerospace Village, came up, that was a great step forward. But the flip side too, from the industry standpoint, is testing on an aircraft is a common concern, and we know that testing on an aircraft shouldn't happen because it's not safe, but doing nothing is also not acceptable. So how can we be curious while being safe and supporting both sides? Back to good old regulation, and I think it is specifically 355. You need to prove that systems are secure, and testing is one way of validation. So all the parties need to work together, and I'm looking forward to coming back to the Aerospace Village as a potential somewhat neutral third party, and come with my research hat on to see how we can continue to improve the way that we're testing these systems. The other item I like to support a lot is that I have a constant issue of a lack of trained cybersecurity professionals. And it's in general, it doesn't matter what industry that you're in, but to make it even more complex is that you need a certain specialty to understand how all of this works together in the aviation ecosystem. And that in itself is a unicorn of a person. And in order to build that up, we need to train the next set of professionals. You just can't say, I hate the job descriptions where it's like, it's kind of entry level, but we want this experience. But how do you get this experience? There's not a class you can take right now for aviation cybersecurity that's in theory open to the public. So where do you start off if you're new? My recommendation, if you're really new, is everything that I mentioned in this presentation. Go back, read those articles, do your initial homework, because one thing I've noticed back when I supported a bug bounty program is that if we had a researcher that provided information that said, you know what, I found this vulnerability, I know it may not be applicable because of so-and-so standard, or we know you have these safety things in there, but we want to make you aware of this. It's sort of, it makes you look knowledgeable that you did your homework at first, is one bit of advice. And with that, I'm going to just, proof is in the pudding of all said references. And once again, this is on my website as well, so don't massively screenshot right now. But I really want to thank everyone for attending this presentation on a Saturday morning. I know it could be nice to sleep in and whatnot, but I hope it gave you a little bit of insight into the world of aviation cybersecurity and that it sparked your interest. I want to leave you with the feeling that the aviation industry really cares about the cybersecurity mission, and they want to continue to work with the research community. So keep pinging us. Please don't have complaints. And more importantly, let's keep the conversation going. So the top one's my Twitter handle. If you're on Discord, that's my number for Discord. I'm not gonna lie, I'm on Discord infrequently, so ping me on Twitter most of all, or through my website. And if you have a minute or two, I'd really appreciate it if you could give some feedback via my survey.